The thermometer on the side of Calvin Boudreaux's step-side truck read 4 degrees above zero. It was 5:42 in the morning, the sky over the Flathead Valley still the color of wet slate, and Calvin was on his knees in the snow trying to thread a length of half-inch black pipe into a steel coupling. His hands were bare. He had tried gloves. The gloves made him clumsy, and clumsy in this cold meant cross-threading, and cross-threading meant the pipe would leak, and a leak in a buried line at 4 degrees meant starting over. So he worked barehanded in 2-minute bursts and warmed his fingers in his armpits between turns. 60 feet behind him, steam rose off a shallow pool of water tucked against a low rock shelf. The pool was not on any map. The locals called it the Seep. It ran 112 degrees year-round, and it had been used by ranchers, road crews, and drifters for as long as anyone in Sanders County could remember. A man named Otis Kroll walked past on the gravel pull-off, holding a dog on a frayed yellow rope. Otis lived in a converted school bus parked 100 yards up the spur road. He stopped, looked at Calvin, looked at the pile of pipe, and laughed once. It was not a cruel laugh. It was a laugh of a man who has watched a dozen people try a dozen things in a dozen winters. "You're gonna freeze that line solid before you ever feel a drop of warm," Otis said. He spit into the snow. "Whatever you're building out here, brother, the cold's gonna eat it." Calvin did not look up. He kept turning the wrench. He had heard word from better men. Calvin Boudreaux was 4 to 7 years old. He had grown up in Lafayette, Louisiana, and he had followed pipeline work the way other men follow seasons. North Dakota, West Texas, Oklahoma, Wyoming. 22 years of 6,010 route passes and 7,018 caps, of welding hoods scarred white from the sun, of motel rooms that all smelled the same. He had been good at it. Pipeline welders are graded on X-ray pass rates, and Calvin's was 96% over his career. He made $110,000 in his best year. He bought a small house in Sydney, Montana. He married a woman named Renee. They had a daughter named Junie in 2015. The first crack came in 2020, when the Bakken layoff cascaded down the contractor chain. Calvin's crew was let go on a Tuesday in March. He found short work for a year, then another stretch, then nothing. The house went in 2022. Renee left in early 2023, citing what the paperwork called instability. The custody order gave him supervised visitation twice a month, contingent on a permanent address. He did not have a permanent address. He had a 1998 step-side Chevy with a campus shell and a milk crate full of welding gear he had refused to pawn. He had $840 in a credit union account. He had a photograph of Junie taped to the dashboard, a school picture from kindergarten, taken before her front teeth came in. He drifted west. He slept in trailheads and church lots. He took a 2-week pipe-fitting gig in Kalispell in October that paid him just enough to fix the truck's transmission. And in early November, following a tip from another welder at a diner counter, he turned off Highway 28 onto a rutted gravel spur and saw the steam rising off the Seep for the first time. He sat in the truck for an hour, just watching it. He knew what he was looking at. He knew exactly what he was looking at. A pipeline welder spends his life thinking about how heat moves through steel. Calvin had spent 22 years watching weld puddles cool, watching frost lines climb up cold pipe, watching how a line full of hot fluid behaves differently than a line full of cold. He understood, in a way most people don't, that water at 112 degrees holds a tremendous amount of usable energy if you can keep it from giving that energy away too soon. The pull-off had 4 other camps strung along it. There was Otis in his school bus. There was a couple named Dean and Brenda selling a living in a 5th-wheel trailer with a failing furnace. There was a quiet Vietnam veteran named Lyle Petrosky in a cargo van with hand-built cedar paneling. And there was a younger man called Trev who slept in a dome tent and ran a propane heater Calvin considered a death sentence. Calvin pulled into a flat patch of ground 60 feet from the spring, turned off the engine, and started taking notes on the back of a fast food receipt. He noticed 3 things in the first week. The Seep did not freeze, even on the night it dropped to 9 below. The ground for about 8 feet around the pool stayed bare and dark while everything else turned white. And there was a natural slope of about 3 feet between the pool and his truck, enough, if he was careful, to run a gravity-assisted return line. He started gathering. He drove 40 miles to a demolition site outside Plains where a barn was coming down and bought a stack of 2x6 lumber for $60 cash. He stopped at a textile recycler in Missoula and walked out with 12 compressed bales of shredded denim insulation for $90. Overstock, cosmetically damaged, perfectly good R value. He scavenged 28 feet of 1-inch black iron pipe from behind an irrigation supply yard, where it had been sitting since the Bush administration. He paid for what he took when he could find someone to pay. He left notes when he couldn't. Otis came by again on the 4th day, with a dog. He looked at the lumber, the insulation bales, the coil of pipe. "Son," he said, "the Seep will cook your feet, but it ain't gonna heat a cabin in February. People have tried. I watched a man named Hollis try it in '09. He froze his ears off and moved to Spokane." Brenda Sellinger came by on the 6th day. She brought a thermos of coffee, which surprised him. She was in her 60s, with a long gray braid and a brace on her left wrist. "I'm not here to laugh at you," she said, "but I am here to tell you my husband's furnace is on its last leg, and if you're building something that works, I want to know how you did it before we both freeze." Calvin nodded. He poured the coffee into a tin cup and held it with both hands. "Give me 3 weeks," he said, "if you want to find out what Calvin built 60 feet from that hot spring, and what happened when the polar vortex came down out of Canada and hit 28 below for 3 straight days, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Calvin Boudreaux built on that spur road outside Hot Springs, Montana, is a story that proves a man's hands remember what the world tries to make him forget." He laid out the cabin at 10 feet by 12 feet. Not bigger. He had run the numbers in his head. A welder thinks in BTUs the way a mechanic thinks in torque, and Calvin estimated the Seep could deliver, through a properly insulated heat exchanger, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 BTUs per hour to a small enclosed space. Anything bigger than 120 square feet would lose the fight. He started with the floor. He set 6 concrete deck blocks on tamped gravel, leveled them with a 4-foot level he had owned since 2003, and laid pressure-treated 2x6 joists across them on 16-inch centers. Onto the joist he laid sheets of 2-inch rigid foam insulation he had bought damaged from a building supply for 30 cents on the dollar. Above the foam, a layer of half-inch plywood. Above the plywood, the loops of half-inch PEX tubing he would later run warm spring water through. That was where he made his first mistake. He had stapled the PEX directly to the plywood in long parallel runs 8 inches apart. It looked beautiful. A pipeline welder's habit, neat lines, even spacing, professional finish. But on the 3rd night, when he tested the system with a small amount of warmed water from a bucket, he watched the PEX expand against the staples and pop loose in 3 places. He sat on the cold plywood floor and stared at it for a long time. Then he drove 40 miles back to the demolition site and bought a stack of aluminum heat transfer plates that had been pulled out of a remodel, the slotted kind designed to cradle PEX and reflect heat upward into a floor. $40 for the lot. He pulled all the staples, set the plates into routed grooves, snapped the PEX into place, and the system held. He did not curse. He did not throw the wrench. He had learned at 23 years old, on a sour gas line outside Williston, that the men who curse their mistakes weld worse than the men who study them. The walls went up next. Standard 2x6 framing, 16 on center. He stuffed the cavities with a shredded denim, packed tight but not overcompressed. Denim insulation loses R value when you crush it, and Calvin had read the spec sheet twice. He sheathed the exterior with reclaimed barn boards, weathered gray and tight-grained. He sheathed the interior with 1/4-inch plywood, stained dark with a half-can of leftover walnut stain Brenda brought over. By the end of the 2nd week, his hands had cracked open along the knuckles in 6 places. He wrapped them in athletic tape every morning. He had lost 11 pounds. He could feel his belt riding looser than it had in a decade. He slept in the truck still, with a photograph of Junie on the dashboard catching the dome light when he opened the door. The Vietnam veteran came over on the 17th day. Lyle Petrosky was 73 years old, thin as wire, and he walked with a slight limp from a piece of shrapnel he had carried in his hip since 1969. He had lived in his cargo van for 9 years. He stood at the edge of Calvin's worksite for a long time before he spoke. Then he said, "You're going to have a hell of a time welding that heat exchanger out here in this wind." Calvin looked up. "I was going to try a windbreak." "Won't be enough. Not at this altitude. Not at these temps. You'll get porosity in every weld. Cold metal sucks the heat right out of the puddle." Lyle scratched his jaw. "I've got a propane forge in the van. Old farrier's rig. You preheat the joint to about 300 degrees. You'll lay a clean bead even at 10 degrees ambient. I'll bring it down tomorrow. Lyle had been a steel fabricator in Akron, Ohio, before he enlisted. He had come home and worked another 31 years at the same shop. He had lost his wife in 2014 and his savings in 2016 to a series of decisions he would not discuss. He told Calvin all of this in roughly 6 sentences over the course of 3 days. The heat exchanger was Calvin's masterpiece. He built it from 22 feet of 1-inch black iron pipe, bent and welded into a flattened spiral that would sit submerged in the deepest part of the Seep, weighted down with 2 flat river stones. The spiral would absorb heat from the spring water. A pair of insulated half-inch lines, buried 18 inches deep in a trench he dug by hand over 4 days, would carry the heated water 60 feet to the cabin and back. There was no pump. Calvin did not have electricity, and he did not want electricity. He was relying on thermosiphon, the principle that warm water rises in cool water falls, and that a properly designed closed loop with a right slope will circulate on its own forever, as long as the heat source holds. It is an old principle. Romans understood it. Calvin understood it because his grandfather had heated a Louisiana shrimp shed with a similar setup, using a wood stove and a coiled copper pipe, and Calvin had helped him plumb it when he was 9 years old. With Lyle's forge preheating each joint, Calvin laid down 24 welds in 2 days. Every one of them passed his own visual inspection. He pressure tested the loop with a hand pump to 60 pounds per square inch and watched the gauge for an hour. It did not drop. The second mistake came on installation day. He carried the heat exchanger to the spring, set it into the pool, and watched in horror as it floated. He had not accounted for the air still trapped in the pipe. He stood knee-deep in 112-degree water in 12-degree air, his jeans soaked, steam rising off his legs, and laughed out loud for the first time in 8 months. He bled the air through a high-point valve. The exchanger settled to the bottom. He wedged the river stones over it. He climbed out of the pool, walked back to the cabin in soaked jeans that began to freeze at the cuffs by the time he reached the door, and opened the valve on the supply line. It took 40 minutes. Then he felt it, a faint, patient warmth, rising up through the soles of his boots from the floor he had built with his own hands. He sat down in the middle of the cabin floor. He had brought in a single folding chair, a sleeping pad, a wool blanket, and a thermometer from a hardware store in Plains. The thermometer outside the window read 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermometer on the floor of the cabin read 48. An hour later it read 61. 3 hours later it read 79. By midnight, with the door shut and the single small window covered with a quilted moving blanket, the interior of the cabin held steady at 84 degrees. The differential was 70 degrees. Calvin lay on his back on the warm plywood floor and looked up at the ceiling joists he had set himself. The cabin smelled of fresh-cut lumber, walnut stain, and faintly of the mineral scent that came up off the spring on still nights. He could hear the soft tick of the PEX expanding under the floor. He could hear, very far away, a coyote. He did not cry. Exactly. His eyes watered, and he wiped them with the back of his taped hand, and he thought about Junie. He thought about the last time he had seen her, in a supervised visitation room in Sydney with fluorescent lights and a plastic table, where she had asked him if his new house had a kitchen. He had not had a house. He had told her he was working on it. He had not been lying. Exactly. He had been describing a future he could not yet see. Now, lying on a heated floor he had built from a hot spring in a pile of scrap, he thought, I can show her this. I can bring her here. There is a kitchen counter to build, and a bunk for her, and a window for the morning sun. But there is a floor. The floor is real. The floor is warm. He fell asleep on the plywood without meaning to. He slept 11 hours. It was the longest sleep he had taken in 2 years. If you have ever felt like the work of your hands stopped being seen by anyone who mattered, consider subscribing to stay connected with this community, because there are people all over this country building quiet, careful things in places no one is looking, and their work deserves a witness. Connection is its own kind of shelter. The polar vortex hit the Flathead Valley on the night of February 4th. It had been forecast for 6 days. A lobe of Arctic air, displaced from its usual rotation over the pole, sliding south through Alberta and into northwestern Montana with sustained temperatures the National Weather Service called life-threatening. The local AM station read warnings every 20 minutes. The county opened a warming center at the high school gym in Plains, 22 miles away. The temperature on the spur road dropped to -18 by 10 p.m. on the 4th, -26 by 3 a.m. on the 5th. It bottomed out at -31 on the morning of the 6th and held below -20 for 72 consecutive hours. The wind ran 15 to 25 miles per hour out to the northwest. The wind chill, by the radio's reckoning, sat between -50 and -60 for most of 3 days. Things began to fail. Dean's Sellinger's furnace died at 11:40 p.m. on the 4th, exactly as Brenda had feared. The propane regulator on Trev's tent heater froze solid by midnight. Otis Kroll's school bus held heat for one more day on a wood stove before he ran out of seasoned wood and started burning a stack of pallets, then his spare plywood, then a kitchen chair he had been meaning to fix. The propane delivery truck that served the spur road could not get up the grade on the 5th. The driver tried twice and turned back. A diesel pickup belonging to a man 2 miles down the road would not start at all, its battery dead from the cold, and the man walked 4 miles to a gas station before someone gave him a ride. In a trailer park 6 miles east, an 81-year-old woman named Lurleen Marsh, whose space heater had been confiscated 3 months earlier as a fire risk by her park manager, was found by a neighbor on the morning of the 6th. She had died sometime in the night. The county coroner ruled it hypothermia. Her name was read on the radio that evening. Inside Calvin's cabin, the floor thermometer read 81 degrees. The Seep had not flinched. 112 degrees. Steady, the steam rising thicker now against the colder air. The heat exchanger pulled what it needed. The thermosiphon ran without a sound. Calvin had banked the cabin's lower walls with snow on Lyle's advice, a trick from a winter Lyle had spent at a fire base in 1968, and the snow itself acted as insulation against the wind. Brenda Sellinger came first, with Dean leaning on her arm. Dean was shivering hard, his lips a color Calvin did not like. Calvin opened the door and said, "Sit on the floor. Take your boots off. Put your bare feet on the wood." Dean Saturday. Within 20 minutes he had stopped shivering. Within an hour he was asleep against the wall with a wool blanket over his shoulders. Otis came at 2 in the afternoon on the 6th with the dog. He stood at the door with a rope in his hand and did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "I was wrong about the Seep, brother." Calvin opened the door wider. "Bring the dog in," he said. "Floor's warm." Otis Saturday. The dog stretched out flat on the plywood like it had been waiting its whole life for that floor. Otis looked at the heat transfer plates visible through a small inspection cutout Calvin had left in one corner, and he looked at the supply line coming up through the wall, and his eyes filled, and he turned his face toward the window and did not speak for a while. Trev came at sunset. Lyle came up at midnight after his van's heater failed, walking the quarter-mile from his pull-off with a propane forge on a sled because he didn't trust leaving it. By the morning of the 7th, Calvin's 10-by-12 cabin held 6 adults and 1 dog, and the floor thermometer still read 76 degrees. Nobody made a speech. Nobody apologized. Brenda made instant coffee on a small camp stove that Calvin had set up in a vented corner. Dean ate a granola bar slowly and held the cup in 2 hands. The dog snored. Outside, the wind sounded like a freight yard. At one point, around 4 in the afternoon on the 7th, Lyle leaned over to Calvin and said, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, "You built this right. Son, I want you to know that. You built this right." Calvin nodded once. He did not trust his voice. The vortex broke on the morning of the 8th. The temperature climbed to 4 above zero by noon, 18 by sunset. It felt, after 72 hours below -20, like spring. The propane truck made it up the grade on the 9th. Dean's furnace was repaired by a technician who charged nothing after Brenda told him what had happened. Otis split a load of seasoned tamarack. A man down the road gave him for free. The dog slept for 2 days straight. A woman named Priya Achterberg came up the spur road on the 11th. She worked for a regional housing nonprofit out of Missoula and had heard, through a chain of 3 phone calls, about a cabin on a hot spring that had kept 6 people alive through the vortex. She wore a parka and carried a clipboard and a small thermal imaging camera. She asked Calvin if she could document what he had built. Calvin let her in. She walked the perimeter of the heat exchanger trench. She photographed the heat transfer plates. She read the floor thermometer, which still ran 68 degrees on a 30-degree afternoon with the door open. She asked Calvin where he had learned thermosiphon design, and he told her about his grandfather's shrimp shed. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I want to bring 2 engineers up here next week. I want to write this up. With your permission." Calvin asked what it would mean for him. She said it would not get him in trouble with anyone. The land status was complicated but defensible, and the nonprofit had lawyers. It might mean, she said, that what he had built could be drawn up as a plan and shared with other people in similar situations, with his name on it. He thought about that. He thought about Junie. He thought about what it would mean to have a piece of paper, somewhere with his name on it, attached to something that worked. He said yes. Otis came over that evening with a half-pint of bourbon he had been saving. He poured 2 fingers into 2 tin cups. They drank without toasting. Otis said, "You know what I keep thinking about? Hollis, the man who tried this in '09. I keep thinking maybe he wasn't wrong. Maybe he was just early." Calvin nodded. Maybe nobody showed him how to weld in the cold. Calvin Boudreaux is still on that spur road as of the most recent winter. The cabin is still standing. The Seep still runs 112 degrees. He has added a small covered porch and a second sleeping bunk, sized for a child, with a window that faces east. His daughter Junie visited for the first time in the fall of the year after the vortex. Renee drove her out, stayed for an awkward 40 minutes, and left them alone for the afternoon. Junie was 8 years old. She walked around the cabin twice, pressed her bare feet to the warm floor, and asked her father how he had made the floor be warm without a furnace. He told her. She listened the way children listen when they understand they are being told something true. The plan Priya wrote up, with 2 engineers and a building scientist from the state university, has been used in 3 other locations in the West so far. 1 in Oregon, 2 in Idaho. None of them are exactly the same as Calvin's. Each one is adapted to the heat source available, the materials at hand, the skills of the person doing the building. The plan is not a kit. It is a way of thinking. Lyle Petrosky died in the spring of the 2nd year, peacefully, in a hospice bed in Plains. Calvin sat with him for the last 6 hours. The propane forge sits in Calvin's cabin now, on a shelf above the door, and he uses it sometimes to heat coffee water. Otis still lives in the school bus. He has a better wood stove now, and a stack of seasoned tamarack that takes up half his yard. He waves at Calvin every morning. What I want you to take from this story is something quiet. Calvin Boudreaux did not invent thermosiphon. He did not discover that hot spring. He did not do anything that a Roman engineer would not have understood 2,000 years ago. What he did was refuse to forget what his hands knew, in a country that had told him his hands were no longer needed. He took 22 years of pipeline welding and a grandfather's shrimp shed and a photograph on a dashboard, and he built a floor that was warm. When the vortex came, the floor held. And when his neighbors came, the door opened. Ask yourself this. What do your hands remember that the world has stopped asking about? And what would it take, in a hard winter, for someone to be glad you remembered? If you stayed with this story to the end, that means something. Most people don't. Most people scroll. You sat with a man you'll never meet, on a road you'll never drive, and you let his work matter to you for a little while. And that is not nothing. There is another story on this channel waiting for you right now. Another person who built something quiet and necessary in a place no one was watching, and who survived a winter most of us would not have survived. These stories exist because the people in them deserve to be seen, and because the knowledge in their hands deserves to outlast them. Consider staying. Until next time, take care of your hands, and take care of each other.